With that, we're going to hand on to our next speaker. Now, I'll give a very brief intro. So I actually work for my day job for Visa Europe. And back last, or 2020, I think it was, when there was a real awakening, as I mentioned, of some of the issues that we still face today, I was really proud of Visa being an organization which embraced the topic and in a similar but a different approach to Moy Hennessy. And that was where actually I first encountered Leyla, who came in to give us, similar to this, a virtual session. And it was one that really helped me get better, feel more comfortable to understand some of the key terminology and the topic and how to really start to discuss and think about what I could do. So we're really delighted that Leyla's agreed to join us for this session today. And I think she'll be able to, really give us a great overview and understanding of the subject and how we can all really start to engage in it. So please do pop the questions again in the chat. Once Leyla's finished her presentation, we'll definitely have the opportunity to come and discuss. So yeah, Leyla, thanks so much for being with us today, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, for the introduction. Really kind. And yeah, really excited to be here. And listening to Scott was fascinating for me because I'm not in the industry. So thank you for that, because I always learn too. So welcome, everyone. It's going to be a bit of an intro. I'm sure I'm going to be picking up on a lot of the things that Scott mentioned. And I just was taking some notes. So with the Q&A, so I can pick up on some of the things that might have been asked. So as Lindsay said, yes, please use the chat box at any time. Also, just as I talk through things, just acknowledge that we're all on a journey. And Scott said this, you don't really get to a destination unless we can get to utopia. So maybe some of the things I'm talking about might feel uncomfortable. That is not my intention, to make anyone feel uncomfortable. But inevitably, I don't think we have always enough space to talk about these topics. So there may be a bit of discomfort. So if there is, I would say acknowledge that and be curious and inquire what that might be about. The whole conference today is about embracing new ways of thinking and doing things, and think about how you might like to hold yourself accountable, your team accountable, your winery accountable, and be ready to take action. So just going to cover off today defining the terms, first of all, and I will be talking more about language as well, but equity, diversity and inclusion, and to reflect on what does inclusive practice mean to you in your organization. Maybe organization seems like quite a big word, but as members of WineGB and what you do, what does that mean to you? How inclusive language is so useful, and Scott, thank you for mentioning people asking, can I use this term? And it's really important to understand that language changes, and what the terminology is today, maybe in 5 years' time, 2 years' time, may not be what people say, but it's an evolving conversation that we can't shy away from. And to think about what's going well and what could be improved in this area. And I've got some resources for you at the end that you might like to think about. I know you were talking about roadmaps earlier, and information that's out there. And I also want to touch on some other information that might be useful to you. Okay, so I know I can't see you. I know we've just met, but I'm going to invite you all. I'm going to have a space where I'm going to invite you all to my an outdoor space. We're going to have a marquee, and this is what I'm going to make for you. And I'm sure you could tell me the perfect wine pairings for all of these. But we're going to have to start lobster bisque, crab pate on whole milk crostini. We're then going to have venison steak with red wine sauce, mashed potato, butter chives, fresh petit pois and steamed broccoli. And for dessert, I'm serving rich almond and cherry torte, served with caramelized hazelnuts, peanuts and almonds, and a side of clotted cream. So I'd really like to know who could eat everything on this menu. You might want to reflect, or if you want to just put a Y in the chat. So out of everyone here today, I'd really like to know who could eat every single thing on the menu. And just show me in the chat. Okay. So we've got a no. Yes. Okay. A couple of yeses. Yeses. Me, now you're hungry. Okay, great. No, no. Yep, what will vegans eat? Thank you for that question. Yep, no. Okay, brilliant. So quite a few yeses, but we've also got some no's. Okay, so I would say maybe 75% right, nothing gluten-free. Yep, absolutely right, Vidya. 75% of you might be able to come to my dinner, lunch, whatever I'm going to do. Now, for those of you who can't eat everything on the menu, if I then turned around to you and said, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. My lobsters are coming from Canada. My venison's been booked in with the best estate in the UK, and my nuts are coming from Turkey. I'm so sorry. I can't change anything. What would you do? How would that make you feel? So maybe just hear from a few people in the chat as well on that one. Excluded. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Would you come? Yeah, you wouldn't feel welcome. Excluded, you couldn't eat it. I would have told you beforehand. Thank you. Disappointed and excluded. Uncomfortable. And some people are really kind and they say to me, oh, well, I'd come, but I wouldn't eat anything, or I'd bring my own food. And I'm like, wow, you're very forgiving of me. Okay, absolutely. So really the onus is on me, right? So I've created this menu and I thought, right, this communicates luxury, I care, and I've written it in a font that probably isn't really very accessible either. But my intention was not to exclude you, but the onus was absolutely on me to check dietary requirements, allergies, cultural requirements, religious requirements. I've not done any of that. And I've gone in and I've gone gung-ho and whoops, I haven't seen my blind spots. Now, you might think, why on earth is she talking about a menu? But for me, I think this illustrates the point that what we may perceive as being the best will not suit everyone, because we will see things from our own lens. And it goes beyond this concept of political correctness. And I mention this because, unfortunately, I feel this is very much in the vernacular all the time, in the media, on social media, and lots of debates about identity politics. And I don't really feel it's about that. It's the things you've mentioned in the chat. You don't feel welcome. You don't feel included. I'm not coming from a bad place. I really wasn't. But I really needed to do my homework better and reflect and think. And of course, we all make mistakes. And you've heard that with the previous speaker. And that's natural. We don't have all the answers. You know, I've worked in this field for nearly 20 years, and I'd love to say, I know everything about everything, but I really don't. And I think it's that point that it's okay to ask for help, advice, and direction. And you might be thinking, well, that's a very obvious thing. But I think a lot of the time there's pressure to know everything. Or, you know, you run this business, you run a winery, you're thinking about marketing, you're thinking about sales, you're thinking about the visitor experience. But it's that feedback consistently and being open to that, because it is an ongoing journey. And then I want to, you know, maybe you'd like to reflect on these terms. And I've put them up here because they are used a lot, and equity or equality, diversity and inclusion. And of course, equity is slightly different to equality. Equality about making sure people can get to the door, equity about making sure that that door is barrier free. But really think about, what do these terms mean to you as an individual? And what do these terms mean to you in terms of the work that you're doing, and what you hope to achieve in your aspirations and your business goals? Because we have a sense of what they might mean, but again, I think they can be personalized too. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts and a definition that I find quite useful, but by no means is this the only definition. And I've adapted this over time. Some of you might know the book by Charlotte Sweeney and Fleur Bothwick, Inclusive Leadership. It was published in 2016, so things have moved on. But they start the book by talking about definitions, and I've really adapted it and added to it. But I would say that equity is being invited to a meeting, if we think of a traditional work style office, in a time, in a format that works for you. So is it accessible in a time that works for you? Is it in hours that you can do if you have caring responsibilities, if you work 2 jobs, etc.? Diversity is having a seat at this meeting alongside a variety of colleagues with different views, opinions, life experiences. And inclusion is about sharing your views uninterrupted, being heard, and your points being taken on board for the betterment of the business and what you're doing. Now, it'd be interesting to know, and please type in the chat, I'd love to hear from you, what, you know, how this sits with you. Does this resonate? And there might be things that you think, oh, we could tweak that, or actually our business has got this in our aims and objectives, and we could add that to make it that business as usual and that day-to-day embedded practice. So we know the law. I'm not an employment lawyer, so I don't want to go into huge detail, but we know the law is there to protect us, or it is definitely at the moment still there. And it covers a variety of characteristics, protected characteristics as they're known in law. But then what does this really mean when we start to think about diversity? And I would say it's a range of visible and non-visible differences, characteristics that exist between people, and they may stay static or they may change. And these include, but they're not limited to, our gender identity. Are we binary? Do we see ourselves as male, female? Do we see ourselves as non-binary, not male or not female? And we then decide which pronouns will suit us and which pronouns we want people to use. Experience of barriers. And for me, that's a really useful way of thinking about accessibility and disability. It's how people will experience society and the way society is created for a specific type of person. And if people don't fit into that mold, there will be barriers there. It doesn't just apply to disability, but I think it really is the biggest hurdle a lot of the time, from physical accessibility, way that documents might be structured, the way that papers are expected to be written, the way that classifications and categorizations are done. They may not suit people who are on the neurodivergent spectrum, for example. And of course, within that, the umbrella categories of disability, there is the individual within that. So I would say that no two disabilities are identical. So if two people have diabetes, the likelihood is, yes, we know what the impacts of diabetes, but it might be one person has type 1, one person has type 2. They will manage it differently, and thinking about that. Ethnicity, nationality, and culture, and these terms are used interchangeably. So we think about race, which is obviously the color of our skin, and in many ways it is very arbitrary, but of course we have to acknowledge it because of the trajectory and because of the legacy of the way race, skin color was effectively used to divide people. But we all have an ethnicity that we decide how we want to identify. We all will choose a nationality. We normally have a passport or kind of nationality that we belong to. We may not always identify with it. And we also have a culture, and that is an individual culture, can be a family culture, a country culture, work culture. So it's really important to acknowledge all of that. And culture is very layered and it can be very nuanced. We will also all have a sexual identity, how we define in terms of our sexual orientation and sexuality. It may be certain faiths. And again, there's a lot of plurality in faith. We can have groups of people that identify as being from the same faith, and how they then express that faith and practice that faith, there is usually some kind of variance. We think about all the churches in the UK. I think it's a testament to that. Educational experiences and how people have had access or not had access to that education. Age expectations. It's a phrase that's not really used very much anymore, but things like silver surfers, when the internet was kind of advancing, people with grey hair using the internet, wow, well done them. What do we expect? And do we expect people who are younger to be fitter and stronger and free of ill health, for example? Family and marital and economic status. And this can change. So lots of things can change, lots of things can stay static. How that diversity is there, the experience, usually with age, we tend to gain experience. And thinking about all of that, all those aspects of it, and you could keep adding to this list. Maybe it's a conversation that you'd like to have to think about, well, what do we mean when we talk about diversity? There is so much to it, and we don't fit neatly in one box, and that's a really good thing. So with inclusion, the definition in the context of this presentation, and you might like to go away and think about, well, what does inclusion really mean for us? Is celebrating, nurturing, and appreciating how diversity builds strong teams by acknowledging the value of each individual. But it's also about considering proactively how we can see things from a variety of lenses. Like my menu, I wasn't seeing it from a variety of a different lens, and remove barriers for customers, guests, clients, beneficiaries, different terms that you use in recruitment, etc. So the whole spectrum. So why is this important then? Why should we care about this? And you might be familiar with this report by McKinsey that came out in 2019, and it's one of the biggest, most popular reports because it really quantified the impact. Now, it wasn't done really with organizations like yours. It was done more in big corporate organizations, the work that was carried out. But they found that workforces that are diverse and inclusive have 12% higher employee productivity, 19% higher retention, and 57% higher team collaboration. And, the role model exemplar of inclusive behavior is about listening, seeking out the views of people. So if we go back to our meeting, taking account of these views, asking questions and decisions, appreciating that if we have more of different lived experiences around a table, we're going to get different solutions, we're going to have different thoughts, we're going to move away from that groupthink. And it's through a shared vision of future success that motivates them to deliver it. And that was the CIPD's Driving Performance Through Diversity report in 2016. So again, we're going back a bit, but I think these things are still relevant today. So the business case, it's shown that inclusive teams make better business decisions 87% of the time. And as a result of that, you're going to drive profit forward. So if we don't do this right, we're actually leaving money on the table. And that innovative thinking, I think businesses that have survived the pandemic have been able to innovate and do things differently. Human case, no one likes to feel left out. No one likes to feel they're over there. They're just there to work. Their voice doesn't matter. They're not important. And the customer case, building connections and to think meaningfully about inclusivity makes us all better leaders. Opening up the space, the experience, you want your visitors and guests to have a brilliant experience and tell 10 friends about it. And also to keep that relationship. We know that it's great business to keep the business you already have. So yes, you want new business, but you also want to build those connections with those clients that you have. And remember, Anais Nin says, we see the world as we are, not as it is. So we will all see things from our lens, and it's exploring that lens that can be really important. And something I encourage people to do is to go away and reflect on their identity and culture. So what makes you you? How would you define your culture? And share it in a team meeting and to talk about, this is my perspective. This is how I see things. Sorry, I don't know why that went forward. This is how I see things, and to share really your perspectives, because I think that can be a really useful exercise in starting to embed this and have these conversations. But you also don't have to put anything private into the public, but really defining what culture and identity mean to you, and communicating that with each other. So how can this manifest in the workplace in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion, equity, culture? So hierarchy, is it really important to have a hierarchical structure? Sometimes you can't avoid that, but how is there still a balance in terms of appreciating people? So you may need that hierarchy. It may create a really useful structure, but is it a massive power imbalance, or is it hierarchy in terms of accountability and support? Dress code and style. Now, I know a lot of the work might be, it's physical, it's outdoors. So likelihood of wearing suits is low, which is a good thing. It's got to be practical. But how does this play into it? Is there something around expectations? It's an interesting one, actually, because dress code and style are something you can see. And of course, they're jobs that are practical, as I said, and you need to dress a certain way. But again, does that feed into hierarchy in a positive way, in a negative way? Are there times where everyone dresses up and you celebrate the achievements? Or is it, certain people never get that opportunity? And digging into that and thinking, what does this actually communicate? Then how communication is done. So that could be internal communication, how people are spoken to, the language that's used, how people have access to emails, because it could be central office or the people in charge are always on the computers, other people aren't. Do they have smartphones? What's the communication? It could be around language barriers. There's a lot there. And I know that in some organizations, people will never pick up the phone, and that can make things really difficult. And also how people like to be communicated with. Do they need things broken down? It's simple read, easy text, anything like that. So there's so much to communication. Blame or openness. So how, when things go wrong, is it a blame culture, or is there, okay, sugar, that did go wrong. It wasn't great. What can we learn from this? What can we all collectively understand? And it can also link back to communication. And these are just things you might look at this and say, well, how is this equity, diversity, and inclusion? I think good business practice links in with that, so they're not mutually exclusive. And if we think about values as well, profit versus people, I'm not saying you don't want to make a profit, you do. But if we know that if we look after our people, they're our most valuable asset, and make people feel included and listened to, we're more likely to retain them. Retention equals saving of costs, because it costs a lot to recruit people. We can create a really professional, collaborative community environment in the workplace, and we can then it leads to profit as well. So thinking about all those aspects and how it manifests itself in the workplace in these practical ways.
I'm going to have a slight issue of echo going on.
Okay, can you not hear me very well?
Sorry, Leyla, I think they've just accidentally unmuted themselves, but they're back on mute, so please proceed.
Okay.
Thank
No
you.
worries, thank you. And then I wanted to share with you this wheel, and what I would say is, think of it as advantage and disadvantage. So we all will have some advantages and some disadvantages in terms of societal frameworks. And this is very much Western European perspective. But given that's where we're based, it's helpful to think about. And I'm going to just talk us through this because some of the language I wouldn't necessarily use in the UK, so we can talk about that. But to consider where the advantages and disadvantages lie and how we might be able to equalize the playing field a little bit. So we could also spread this wheel out and think of it as a graphics equalizer. And also I would say that in this diagram for ease, each of the wedges is equal, but it may be that some of the wedges have more weight, if you like, than others. So something you might like to think about. But if we start with citizenship, so closer to power, we've got someone who's a UK citizen from birth, then someone documented, and then someone undocumented. And then skin color, closer to power, we've got white, and we've got different skin shades and then darker skin shades. So even within communities of color, we will see colorism and shadism. Then education is an interesting one. And I think here in this diagram, closer to power is post-secondary, then high school education and what we would call primary education. I also think for the UK, we could think of it as private education, private school education, good state school, low resourced, poor achieving state school all being secondary schools. And then closer to power, we have, it says able-bodied, I would use the term non-disabled, some disability, and then significant disability. Sexuality, we've got heterosexual closer to power, then gay man, and then lesbian, bi, pan, and asexual. And you might have some thoughts on that. We always have some discussions around, why is gay man in the middle? And you might have some thoughts on that. And then neurodiversity, neurotypical closer to power, some neurodivergence, significant neurodivergence. So that might be on the upper end of the autistic spectrum where someone needs support. Mental health, I wouldn't say robust, I would say no experience of mental ill health, some experience of mental ill health and long-term mental ill health, particularly when it's unsupported. Closer to power, we've got slim and then average body size and large. But yes, people always challenge me on this and they say, well, look at the government at the moment. I don't think closer to power is slim. You might have your own opinions on that. And then housing, we've got closer to power owns a property, then sheltered or renting, and then homeless or actually people who are working poverty, their benefits don't cover their home and they can't work, tax credits, etc. Closer to power, I would say, wealthy, how you define that. We could have a long conversation about that. Then middle class, and then further away, it's low socioeconomic status, in poverty, struggling. Closer to power, English, first language, could also be bilingual, trilingual, particularly in European languages, I think. Then learn English, and then non-English monolingual, which I think in terms of workers can often be the case, can't it? I've been given some information that many Romanian people come here to work in the wine industry. So yes, they do speak English, but some may not, or they learn English on the job. I don't know, you can challenge me on that one. Then closer to power, cisgender man, so someone who is born male and identifies as male. Cisgender woman, someone who is born female and identifies as female. And then trans, intersex, and non-binary. So you might like to think about where your advantages are dialed up, where they might be dialed down. If anyone's done a life wheel in coaching, you can, you plot where you are and you look at your circle. This is similar. And to think about then, where are the barriers for people? Where are the difficulties in entry point, keeping people for recruitment? And I know you're going to get more on that, retention, supporting people, our visitors, our customers, whatever it is, to start putting it together. And of course, religion isn't on here, age isn't on here. We could, as with all of these things, keep adding to it and really thinking about which areas are dialed up, dialed down, what is the norm. If we're all dialed up, for example, in terms of able-bodied, how would we really know what significant disability might be? Or if someone wants to come and visit us and they're caring for someone, how would we make those adjustments for them to have a really positive experience, just as an example. And then I wanted to touch on microaggressions, and this is a term that actually came about in the 70s, but had a lot of exposure, I think, when the June 2020 Black Lives Matter movement. And this is, I think, very common, what we see in daily life. So it's rare, I think, in our workplaces that people are going to be standing outside with placards saying X group go home, but things that slip out and come about. So microaggression is defined as a brief, commonplace, verbal or behavioral outward display that communicates hostile, exclusionary, derogatory or negative prejudicial slights and insults towards any group. Now, it could be unintentional or it could be intentional. What the key is the impact and how it's received by the recipient, and how then we respond and have a conversation if we've made a mistake or we've made someone feel that they are in an exclusionary, derogatory or hostile environment. So here are some examples. Out of context, women, let's say someone's gotten married and they're female and they say, oh, when are you going to have a baby? Or have you got any kids? You don't know this person. I know lots of people have told me about random strangers touching their pregnancy bumps. Anyone with a visible disability being asked, oh, what's happened to you then? Assumptions linking certain sexual orientations and promiscuity, and that being said very openly. Being asked, where are you from? Someone says, Suffolk. Oh, really? Where are you really from? Because of their skin color. I think you need more experience. Now, of course, this doesn't have to be a microaggression, but the context in which I'm sharing it is often said to Black staff who have been in a role for several years. They may have trained their colleagues, they ask for a promotion and they're told, oh, no, I think you need more experience. Touching Black hair without permission, touching a hijab without permission, asking questions like, oh, does Asian scale go pale? Does Black skin tan? And often the pushback I get here is that, well, I'm really curious about people. I really like to know about people. And so are you telling me I shouldn't be friendly? That's not what I'm saying at all. I think we always have to remember what's key here is how we have a relationship with someone and our connection. And are we asking for their benefit? Or are we asking because we feel we have the right to know? So the difference would be if you do have someone who identifies as having a disability, a disabled person, you can say, oh, brilliant, you're coming to see us today, or you're coming for an interview. I just want to check, do you require any adjustments, or do you have any access requirements? We'll be delighted to make them for you. So if you need a blue badge parking space, etc. And that way you're not asking someone to divulge their private information publicly or saying, what do you need? I'll put it in place for you. So someone says, oh, I just need, maybe if you could mark out the path with a yellow tape so I know where I'm coming in, or I need a parking space. That's very different. And if you're sharing something, think about, Christmas, for example, and you're saying, oh, at Christmas or Easter, this is my tradition, this is what we do, and you're inviting someone to share that with you, then that's very different because you're sharing something about yourself. I think often what happens is it feels very one-sided, but think about building that relationship. Are you asking for their benefit or because you feel you have the right to know, you feel a bit nosy? And you also don't know someone's triggers and the experiences they've had. So it's really important to reflect on, okay, just let's take a step back. Why am I asking this question? Or the way in which you ask the question as well. And then inclusive language. And I know WineGB have got a great guide on inclusive marketing and comms. So, I mean, I touched on this earlier, but thinking about really what I want to say here is the principles of inclusive language. We know what hate speech is. And as I said, terms change quite rapidly, but let's think about the principles and what might be important. And the other thing is to say that it's the whole way in which we communicate. So it's welcoming words, it's phrases, expressions, it's about avoiding assumptions where we can. And if we get it wrong, we recalibrate, we go back and we change that language on the website, or when we're doing a presentation, or when we're asking interview questions. And remember, of course, it could be inadvertent. But it's that thing of what might we need to think about in terms of email, social media, websites, any form of communication, text messages, maybe you book people in that way. And I just want to share a few examples with you. Now, please don't think this is me being, again, going back to that term, political correctness, the political correctness police. But thinking about pronouns, really important. I think this is really growing in terms of best practice. You can introduce yourself saying, these are my pronouns, because it helps other people to do that. And there might be some other options of pronouns as well that people want to use. Now, the second one, I would say it's completely up to you. What I often get is people saying they feel that guys is very gender loaded, so it's very skewed towards men. If your culture is that you do use guys and people see it as gender neutral, by all means go ahead. But sometimes gender neutral terms like staff members, folks, visitors, esteemed guests can be better. But I will leave that one up to you. I only put it in because I have had many a conversation about that and how people feel that guys is annoying or it's not gender neutral. If you have an exhibition, or if you have a title, or if you're, it could be anything, things like man versus the moon can be adapted to humankind versus the moon. So thinking about that, again, maybe that's not the right fit for your organization and what you're doing for your winery, but I would say have a think about that. It could also be, now I know you probably won't have unaccompanied minors very often, but not everyone grows up with parents. Some people grow up with foster carers, or and this can be really triggering. So this example is really based on so it was for the Science Museum group, where of course they have lots of children and pupils coming in, and they don't say mum and dad, they say give this, you get your grown up or your responsible adult to sign this paperwork. So again, is there something around that? Because I think people's families aren't always perfect, and they're not 2.4. And common sense, ask in advance if you're not sure of something. Anticipatory is better than reactive. So we can be prepared. We can say, you can add questions on forms. You can ask, you can give examples. Are there any adjustments you need to be made? For example, list a few things, and that gives people an opportunity to say, oh yes, I need this, or I need that, or is there a wheelchair accessible toilet where I can turn around? Are there steps? My eyesight's really bad, or whatever it might be. I think that's often something we forget. It's one of those things where most organizations tend to sort of overlook that because of again, our lens and the way we see things through. I'm not saying anyone should stop saying it's raining cats and dogs. Absolutely, if you want to say it, great. It's just the context. And again, this is not saying that people's English isn't good, but UK English is very specific. American English, Australian English, South African English, they're all a bit different, and these phrases may not translate in the same way. Things like, oh, it's awfully good. I mean, again, that's another example of UK English, particularly English. What does that actually mean? It can be really contradictory, confusing, particularly for audiences that are neurodivergent. It's not clear. Using factual language rather than value-laden words and phrases. So an example would be, oh, older drivers are a liability, versus as you get older, driving can be more of a challenge because our eyesight may start to degrade, or our eyesight gets worse. So thinking about that and not lumping people together. I know sometimes you'll need to do that. So maybe you've got a special event for sommeliers, so the sommeliers, which would make sense. But thinking about the women, the disabled, the BAME people, etc. So again, when it might be useful, but also when there might need to be differentiations as well. So I don't expect you to answer all of this, and you will get the slides and there will be a recording, but just for you to consider, given what we've talked about, what's working well at the moment in terms of equity, diversity and inclusion. How do you know this? Do you have conversations about it? Do you get feedback? How are any pay gaps measured between men and women? Do you capture the data actually around age, disability, various ethnicities, including people from different parts of Europe or the world? How do you use any feedback results to make change? So is that evaluations, customer evaluation, staff evaluation? You might be a really tiny team. So are there things that you talk about? When do you have the opportunity to have that feedback conversation? Who are you supporting well? You know, how are you doing this? And supporting doesn't necessarily mean that people need the support, but who's getting a great experience as a customer, as a staff member, as a supplier? You know, I don't know. You can think about that. How are you doing this? I think it's also really important to think about what we're not saying, and what's really uncomfortable about this. And that could link back to thinking about your culture, your cultural profile and framework, and what could we do even better? So yes, there might be a resource issue, but there's some things that don't take much resource really. And they're things that you probably find that you could do quite quickly, with, you know, extra maybe conversation or time to do it. And I know people are really busy. So how could this be a standing item in your existing meetings? We don't have to keep adding. I know time is really precious. People are busier than ever, but how could this be done? And a few ideas for you. So if you have a look, so disability confidence, some of you might have known it as 2 ticks, used to be called the 2 tick scheme. You can sign up for free. It's a government scheme, and it just gives you some bullet points around where to start. And there is a template that you can download. So you might like to have a look at that. The Mindful Business Charter, that's all about mental health and well-being in the workplace. Again, you can sign it. It has some sign up to it. It has some tips on the website. This will also depend on the size of, you know, your winery and what you do. And you might think, oh, this feels quite onerous. But I would say you might want to have a look and see the bits that you can take. So going back to, it doesn't have to be onerous. It doesn't have to be costly. There might be some things you can just tweak and say, oh, right, brilliant. We're going to get much better experience for people. Stonewall Diversity Champion, I would absolutely say have a look and see if that's right for your organization. There has been controversy about Stonewall, so I don't want to tell anyone what to do, but what I will say is it's there, it's a resource, have a look at it. Of course, your diversity and inclusion work that's going on as part of WineGB, really great resources there. Business in the community, they have a gender strand and they have a race strand, and they also do some work on mental health as well. Have a look, and there's lots of resources you can download for free there. And much more discussion in the last 2 years about menopause in the workplace. So this is also really important. This is a menopause friendly accreditation. Henpicked is the organization behind it. Have a look, because a lot of the things they mention around access to clean drinking water, making sure you're near a window, they're brilliant practice for everyone. And that's what I often find with this. You don't have to cater it to just one particular slice of our wheel. If you make things better for a particular strand, what you'll find is most people will benefit from it. Everyone, in my opinion, really easy example is everyone loves a ramp. If you have a pram, if you're having, you know, wheeling trolleys up a slope, they're just great for everyone. If you have a bad knee day, you know, whatever it is. So that whole idea of proactive rather than reactive, I think, is really useful. So thinking about, I'll leave that to you. And if anyone wants to type it in the chat, I'd love to hear, you know, any small action that you want to take or consider following this session. You know, we could talk about this all day, and just to say what we've covered, we've touched on those terms. What do they mean? Maybe you want to go away and think about that. We've looked at inclusive language, why it's important, what it might mean to your organization. And I've left you with some questions to think about what's going well, how do you know, and what could be improved. So just a huge thank you for listening, and I look forward to, I think we've got a few minutes for some questions now, to hearing any thoughts, questions, challenges you might have for me.
Leyla, thank you so much. It was, you know, really great to hear the presentation, really practical, tangible advice that I think we can all take away. Just a reminder to everybody, please do add your questions in the Q&A for Leyla. I think she can stick with us for a few minutes to answer any. There have been a couple come up, so we can start with those. There's a question that might have been related to one of the slides. I'm not completely clear in the context. I'll start with the second question, which was, can you or others explain your differentiations between social mobility and financial mobility?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I suppose, I mean, for me, the two are interlinked, and I suppose, but given, and I'm not, I think there are probably people that can maybe, yeah, I think yeah, some people in the chat might be able to answer this better. There's a sense, isn't there, in the British class system that you do have a particular class. So can you really move socially? And I suppose financial mobility is more about the actual finances and having that money to be able to then give you access to things that you might not have had access to. But, you know, phrases, and this doesn't sit well with me, but I'm going to use it because I think this is the only way I can really pick up on it. But around new money and old money. So I guess it's that old money, landed gentry. You may not actually have pounds in the bank, but you have that social standing and status. Whereas finances, you might not have that social standing and status, but you could, that's something that could change. You could make a lot of money. You could create a business that would give you that financial mobility, but you may still not be accepted potentially. And like I said, I'm not 100% sure on this because I'm not part of that class structure into what would be the higher echelons. So I think for me, that would be the differentiation between social mobility, and social mobility is used, isn't it? There's a social mobility foundation to talk about that, to how people can move from, I guess, again, the term that doesn't really sit very comfortably with me, but working class to middle class, but then to get to that really Etonian level, I think is a bit different in my eyes. But yeah.
Thanks, Leyla. There was a question that actually got asked during Scott's session, but we thought that we'd save it for you. I hope that's okay, because I suspect not an area of his expertise. But somebody asked, how do you ensure that D&I is implemented in countries where they have a different legal or value system, e.g. if it's illegal to be gay in that country?
Yeah, I did see that. And I think that's a really, really important question. And that's something we used to talk about. So with students who would go, because my background's in universities, who would go and do placement work in Russia, for example, and if on their Facebook they were in a same-sex relationship or they identified in that way, there was a real risk to them. So I think one of the things is about doing risk assessments and to think about what is the risk here, what do we do? And I would go back to, you might not have it in the law, but what kind of culture do you want to inculcate? So what does respect mean in that context? And if, you know, people, because the law is important. So if people say, well, you know, it's illegal here, you can say, right, you know, I understand it's illegal, but in the terms of professional context, how do we want to behave with each other? How do we want to support one another? And we don't need to comment on people's, I mean, it is about bringing your whole self to work, but in countries where that's the case, I think maybe the way to frame it is, well, that's there and this is the workplace and we're going to focus on how people do their job and how we work together. Really, really tricky question. And also around protection, around ethnic minority rights. I think pretty much every country has some kind of tension with that. So I would really focus it on how we want to be a professional organization if the law isn't there to support you. But yeah, really great question. And I saw that and I thought, wow, that's that's tough. Or sometimes organizations will take UK frameworks if they're sort of UK led and say, I know this isn't the law, but in the UK this works quite well, so maybe we can try certain aspects of that. I really hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Another question just came in. By being overly supportive in a one-to-one interaction, isn't it the risk of sounding patronizing?
So I think it depends on how you do that, and not everyone needs support. And I think support can sound like people can't cope and do things on their own, which isn't the case. But it might be if we think about how everyone likes to work in a specific way. Now, I know some things will need to be done by the letter for health and safety, for process reasons. But I think it's thinking about where is the flex within that, thinking about how everyone likes to work and having a conversation on that basis. So it's not, oh, I know what's best for you. Oh, gosh, you really need support, pat on the head. But I like to work like this. This is how I've created things. How do you like to work? So this does have to be followed within that framework. What's going to be right for you? So I mean, it's just good management practice, but being really honest and open. And if someone says, well, actually, I find this coding really difficult and I'd like to create something a little bit different, is that possible within the realms? There's normally some flex for that. So yeah, thank you for that question. I hope it didn't come across that I was being very sort of being patronizing, but I think it is about opening up that conversation and being able to have that dialogue and framing it as working styles and preferences.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have. I mean, there's a few comments in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to read. If you have any observations. I mean, a couple coming up around the pronouns as well. And
yes. And that does come up. So thank you about the pronouns. And I understand, and I'm sorry if I've written something wrong about zero tolerance. I know it's incorrect grammatically, yeah, you can't use they or them as a singular pronoun. But I would say that if people identify as that pronoun, that I would really strongly encourage you to use that. Now, most people probably would be fine with he, him, her, singular, but when I know they is for a group, but that's given the way that English is, we don't have a single gender neutral like German, for example. I would say that's why it's important to check people's pronouns. And even though it may be grammatically incorrect, things are shifting, but I do appreciate that. And I've heard that a lot as well. And I also, is this not? Yeah, and language does change over time, and I think social media has sort of accelerated that. And I also wanted to pick up on, so the Equality Act class was left out as a protected characteristic, and my understanding around that, and please correct me, was that it was very hard to quantify. How do you then how do you quantify social class? There are crude measures that people use, so in access to education, parental occupation. It's quite a crude measure, or postcode can also be used, but yeah. So
personally, I really found the wheel of privilege really helpful to consider the different elements that really would give, obviously you look at it and you think about yourself, right? So I can see many areas where I have privilege, and I found it really helpful to, and as I've been listening to sessions like yours today, it's helped me think more externally as to where there might be individuals that come at different places and haven't really considered it or been aware of it in the past. So I think it's an incredibly helpful tool to just break down your own unconscious bias, and really be more aware of where people may be coming from a different position, even though they might look like you. And I think that's an important thing as well when we get into the topic. So super helpful.
So Philippa, I think you can use the wheel as long as you credit it. So you will get the slides sent over to you. Yes, and it's got the credits there. So yes, I would say that can be a really useful tool to have a conversation with your team.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we've covered everything. So once again, Leyla, an enormous thank you. Really, really appreciated the time that you've spent with us today and sharing your experience and insights. So I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and we really, really appreciate it. And let us know if you want to come visit one of our vineyards or wineries. You're welcome at all. We'd love to see you there.
I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Great.